On a warm summer day in June 1775, the hills of Charleston Peninsula bore witness to one of the most pivotal early battles of the American Revolutionary War. In the wake of the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, tensions between the British Crown and the American colonies were at an all-time high. The British held Boston, but the surrounding countryside was firmly in the hands of the Patriots. With the arrival of reinforcements and the growing unrest, the stage was set for a significant confrontation. General Thomas Gage, the British commander-in-chief, sought to break the siege by the colonial militia. Recognizing the strategic importance of the high ground on Charlestown Peninsula, the colonists preempted British plans by fortifying Breed's Hill, mistakenly believing it was Bunker Hill. On the night of June 16, 1775, approximately 1,200 colonial troops, led by Colonel William Prescott, began constructing fortifications on Breed's Hill. By dawn, they had built a strong redoubt, a formidable defense that took the British by surprise. On the morning of June 17, British forces under Major General William Howe prepared to launch a direct assault on the colonial positions. The British believed their superior numbers and training would easily overwhelm the ragtag colonial militia. The first wave of British troops, clad in their bright red coats, advanced up the hill under intense cannon fire from their ships. The colonists, with limited ammunition, were instructed by Colonel Prescott, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The disciplined volleys from the colonial defenders wreaked havoc on the advancing British, forcing them to retreat. Undeterred, Howe ordered a second assault, which met with the same fate. By the time of the third assault, the colonial militia's ammunition was nearly exhausted. This time, the British troops advanced with bayonets fixed, prepared for close combat. Despite a fierce defense, the colonial militia was forced to retreat. The British had won the hill, but at a staggering cost. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, a shocking toll that demonstrated the resolve and capability of the American forces. The Battle of Bunker Hill increased support for the colonial cause, proving that the American patriots could stand toe-to-toe with the mightiest army in the world. The cry of Bunker Hill became a rallying call for the revolution that would lead to the birth of a new nation. Today, the Bunker Hill Monument stands as a testament to the courage and sacrifice of those who fought on that fateful day. It is a symbol of the enduring spirit of freedom and the relentless pursuit of independence that defines the American legacy. Remembering the past, we honor the sacrifices that paved the way for liberty. This is the story of Bunker Hill, where ordinary men became extraordinary heroes.
In the heart of Boston Harbor lies a legend of American naval history, the USS Constitution, affectionately known as Old Ironsides. This majestic frigate symbolizes the resilience and spirit of the United States, standing as the world's oldest commissioned warship afloat. The story of the USS Constitution began in the 1790s when the young United States needed to protect its growing maritime interests. Launched on October 21, 1797, the Constitution was one of 6 frigates authorized by the Naval Act of 1794, designed to be fast and powerful to counter threats from pirates and foreign navies alike. Designed by naval architect Joshua Humphreys, the Constitution was built to be stronger and faster than any rival. Its triple-layered hull, made from resilient live oak, earned it the nickname Old Ironsides when British cannonballs were seen bouncing off during battle. Constructed at Edmund Hart's shipyard in Boston, the USS Constitution was a marvel of engineering. Craftsmen labored meticulously, ensuring every plank and sail was perfect. The ship carried 44 guns, but often more were added, making it a formidable force at sea. In the early 1800s, American merchant ships faced a significant threat from the Barbary pirates off the North African coast. These pirates demanded tribute from nations trading in the Mediterranean. The United States, refusing to pay these tributes, was forced to take military action. In 1803, Under the command of Captain Edward Preble, the USS Constitution set sail as part of a squadron to protect American interests and end the pirate menace. The ship's presence was pivotal in blockading ports and engaging pirate vessels, bombarding Tripoli and contributing to the eventual peace treaty in 1805. This campaign established the United States as a formidable naval power and ensured safe passage for American ships. As the War of 1812 erupted, the USS Constitution faced its greatest tests. The young United States, asserting its sovereignty, went to war against Great Britain over issues including trade restrictions and impressment of American sailors. On August 19, 1812, under the command of Captain Isaac Hull, the USS Constitution engaged the British frigate HMS Guerriere. In a fierce and pivotal battle, the Constitution demonstrated its superior design and firepower. British cannonballs were seen bouncing off its sturdy hull, leading one American sailor to exclaim, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron." Thus, Old Ironsides earned its legendary nickname. The victory against HMS Guerriere was just the beginning. On December 29, 1812, now under the command of Captain William Bainbridge, the USS Constitution defeated HMS Java. These victories not only boosted American morale but also demonstrated the young nation's naval prowess, ensuring the Constitution's place in history as a symbol of American resilience and strength. In 1907, it was designated a museum ship, and today, it is a living testament to American history. The USS Constitution is not only a historic monument, but also a vibrant educational platform. It hosts thousands of visitors annually, offering a glimpse into the life of early American sailors and the ship's storied past. Old Ironsides continues to sail and represents a beacon of American resilience and a living reminder of the nation's early struggles and triumphs on the high seas.
During the 1700s, the city of Boston played a key role in the start of the American Revolution. The city saw important moments in history that led the colonists to rebel against British rule. From violent clashes like the Boston Massacre, protests like the Boston Tea Party, and the Battle of Bunker Hill, Boston became a center of rebellion. And in this city, there lived important patriots that helped advocate the fight for independence. For years, Britain had been passing tax laws on the colonies. These included the Stamp and Township Acts. The colonists had no say in the passing of these new laws and were angered by them. But perhaps none of the colonists were more angered than the citizens of Boston. "No taxation without representation" became a popular slogan among the citizens. To enforce these tax laws, thousands of British soldiers were sent to Boston in 1768. This only made matters worse, as the citizens of Boston saw the soldiers as an occupying force. Citizens would clash with the soldiers, making tensions worse. On March 5, 1770, the tensions between the citizens and soldiers reached a boiling point. That night, a crowd of colonists gathered near the custom house, where soldiers were stationed. The crowd began to taunt the soldiers and threw snowballs, ice, and rocks at them. Tensions escalated, and a soldier fired his gun. Then more soldiers began shooting into the crowd. This resulted in the deaths of 5 men. This tragic event outraged many people in the colonies. Samuel Adams and Paul Revere referred to the event as a massacre. Samuel Adams used the massacre to show how cruel the British were. His cousin, John Adams, defended the British soldiers in court to show that justice was needed, even in times of anger. Most of the soldiers were found not guilty, but the massacre fueled hatred against the British rule and brought the colonies closer together in their desire for independence. In May 1773, Britain passed another tax law called the Tea Act. This new law gave the British East India Company control over tea sales in the colonies. The colonists were angered and saw this as Britain controlling the economy. They began smuggling Dutch tea to avoid paying the tax. On the night of December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and John Hancock, dressed as Native Americans and boarded 3 British ships in the Boston Harbor. They proceeded to dump over 300 crates of tea into the water. This protest angered the British government, resulting in harsher laws to punish Boston. The port was closed to tighten their control over the city. Instead of breaking the colonists' spirit, these actions united them in their potential fight for freedom. John Adams, one of the most important leaders of the Revolution, was born near Boston and was deeply involved in the fight for independence. His beliefs were written into a pamphlet called Thoughts on Government, outlining ideas of republicanism, individual rights, and government laws. Even though he defended the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, he was still a dedicated patriot. He believed everyone had a right to a fair trial, regardless of public sentiment. Adams was a key member of the Continental Congress, which brought together leaders from the colonies to discuss their future. He helped write and push for the Declaration of Independence, making him one of the most influential figures in American history. His dedication to independence and his role as a leader would later make him the second president of the United States. As tensions with Britain continued to rise, John Hancock and Samuel Adams became key leaders in preparing the colonies for open rebellion. Both men had long been active in organizing protests and acts of defiance, but by the early 1770s, they understood that political resistance alone would not be enough. The British government's increasing control over Boston convinced them that the colonies would need to defend themselves if they hoped to win their freedom. John Hancock, one of Boston's wealthiest citizens, used his resources to support the Patriot cause. He had already suffered personally from British trade restrictions, with his ships often seized or heavily taxed. Hancock knew that economic protest could only go so far, and physical resistance might be necessary. Samuel Adams, a fiery leader of the Sons of Liberty, agreed. As one of the most vocal critics of British rule, Adams had organized many protests, including the Boston Tea Party. He was convinced that the British would not back down peacefully and that the colonies would need to fight for their rights. Together, Hancock and Adams began stockpiling weapons, ammunition, and gunpowder in secret locations throughout Massachusetts, particularly in the town of Concord. This was a bold move because under British law, it was illegal for the colonists to gather arms without permission. Their decision to prepare for violence was not made lightly. They saw the British government as an oppressive force that ignored colonial rights and refused to listen to their grievances. For them, the revolution was not just about taxes or trade. It was about the basic right to self-governance. The British soon learned of the hidden stockpiles and saw them as a direct threat. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, received orders to disarm the colonists by seizing these weapons. This set the stage for the confrontation that would spark the war. When Paul Revere learned that General Gage was planning to dispatch British troops to Lexington and Concord to seize the weapon stockpiles, he knew he had to act quickly to warn Hancock and Adams. To signal the British approach, the Old North Church in Boston displayed 2 lanterns. One if the British were coming by land, and 2 if they were coming by sea. As the lanterns lit up, Revere set off on his famous ride. He rode through the night, traveling along the countryside, knocking on doors and alerting residents that the British are coming. Revere was joined by fellow patriot William Dawes, and together they covered significant ground, warning militias and encouraging them to prepare for action. Their ride was instrumental in mobilizing the colonial forces. Thanks to their efforts, the militias were ready to confront the British troops when they arrived at Lexington and Concord the next morning, leading to the first battles of the Revolutionary War. At Lexington, a small group of militia awaited the British troops. When the soldiers arrived, they ordered the militia to lay down their arms and disperse. The encounter resulted in the first shots of the Revolutionary War, with the colonial forces suffering a few casualties. The British continued to Concord, where they faced a larger militia. This time, the Patriots successfully pushed back the British, forcing them to retreat to Boston. These battles marked a significant turning point, motivating the colonial resistance and signaling the start of war. After the Midnight Ride and the victorious battles at Lexington and Concord, the fight for Boston continued. One of the most important battles was the one known as Bunker Hill. Although it is called the Battle of Bunker Hill, most of the fighting actually happened on nearby Breed's Hill, overlooking Boston. The British planned to take control of the hills around Boston to gain a strategic advantage, but the colonial militia moved quickly to defend the high ground. Under the command of Colonel William Prescott, the Patriots built fortifications on Breed's Hill to stop the British advance. The battle that followed was fierce and bloody. Though the British eventually captured the hill, it came at a high cost. They suffered heavy losses, with over 1,000 British soldiers killed or wounded. The colonists lost the battle, but their bravery proved that they could stand up to the British army, which gave them confidence and hope for future battles. The Battle of Bunker Hill proved that the colonists were willing to fight for their freedom, even against a powerful enemy. It also convinced many people, both in the colonies and in Britain, that the conflict was going to be long and difficult. Following the battle, the British solidified their control over Boston, which was now surrounded by colonial forces. The situation soon spiraled into a full-scale siege. The Continental Army, now under the command of George Washington, sought to cut off British supplies and reinforcements, leading to a prolonged standoff. This siege lasted until March 1776, when Washington's forces, having fortified Dorchester Heights with cannons captured from Fort Ticonderoga, positioned themselves to threaten the British. Faced with the threat of bombardment and a direct assault, the British evacuated Boston on March 17th, leaving the city in control of the Continental Army.
In the pages of American history, few figures evoke the spirit of the Wild West more than John Henry Doc Holliday. Dentist, gunfighter, gambler, his life was a whirlwind of adventure. This is the story of a man who lived on the edge, a man who left an indelible mark on the frontier. Born on August 14, 1851, in Griffin, Georgia, John Henry Holliday was raised in the traditions of the Old South. His father, Henry Burroughs Holliday, was a prominent figure, a veteran of the Mexican-American War and later the Civil War. Young John was well educated, showing an interest for the classics and foreign languages. At the age of 19, Holliday left Georgia to study dentistry at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery. Graduating in 1872, he returned to the South to begin his practice. But destiny had other plans for John Henry Holliday. Shortly after starting his practice, Holliday was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a common and deadly disease at the time. Doctors gave him only a few months to live, suggesting a move to a drier climate might extend his life. So, Holliday packed his bags and headed west. In 1873, Doc Holliday arrived in Dallas, Texas. He attempted to continue his dental practice, but found that gambling was far more lucrative. His quick wit and sharp mind made him a natural at the poker table, where he earned both money and reputation. But the life of a gambler was fraught with danger. Holliday's sharp tongue and quick temper often led to conflicts. He became known not just for his skill with cards, but also for his proficiency with a six-shooter. It was during these years that Holliday forged a friendship that would change his life forever. In 1877, Doc Holliday met Wyatt Earp in Fort Griffin, Texas. The two men, both larger-than-life figures, quickly formed a bond based on mutual respect and shared experiences. When Earp became a lawman in Dodge City, Kansas, Holliday followed, cementing their friendship. By 1880, the allure of the silver boom drew Holliday and the Earps to Tombstone, Arizona. It was here that Doc Holliday's legend would be forever written into the pages of history. Tombstone, Arizona, was a town booming with opportunity and conflict. The discovery of silver brought a flood of miners, prospectors, and entrepreneurs. But with wealth came lawlessness, and Tombstone soon became a hotbed of tension between two opposing factions: the lawmen and the cowboys. The lawmen, led by Virgil Earp, who served as town marshal, included his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, along with their close friend, Doc Holliday. They sought to bring order to Tombstone, but their efforts were met with resistance from the cowboys, a loosely organized group of outlaws and rustlers that included Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, and Tom and Frank McLaury. The cowboys were known for their lawlessness, engaging in cattle rustling, stagecoach robberies, and other criminal activities. They resented the Earps' attempts to enforce the law and viewed them as threats to their way of life. The tension between these two groups simmered for months, fueled by mutual distrust and personal grudges. On October 26, 1881, the simmering tensions finally erupted into violence. The Earps and Doc Holliday confronted the cowboys near the OK Corral. When the smoke cleared, Billy Clanton and the McLaury brothers were dead, while Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded. The Earps and Holliday were arrested and tried for murder, but were ultimately acquitted. Despite the legal victory, the violence was far from over. In December 1881, Virgil Earp was ambushed and seriously wounded, losing the use of one arm. Tragedy struck again on March 18, 1882, when Morgan Earp was assassinated while playing billiards. These attacks, widely believed to be the work of the cowboys, pushed Wyatt Earp to the brink. Consumed by grief and rage, Wyatt Earp embarked on what would become known as the Earp Vendetta Ride. With Doc Holliday and a posse of loyal men, Wyatt set out to hunt down the cowboys responsible for his brother's attacks. This was no longer a quest for justice, it was a quest for vengeance. The Vendetta Ride was marked by relentless pursuit and brutal confrontations. Over the course of several weeks, the Earp posse tracked down and killed several members of the cowboy gang. Among those who met their end were Frank Stillwell, who was shot at the Tucson Rail Yard, and Curly Bill Brocius, gunned down near Iron Springs. The Vendetta Ride solidified Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday's legendary status. It was a brutal campaign that blurred the lines between lawmen and outlaws, fueled by a relentless drive for retribution. For Holliday, it was a testament to his loyalty to his friend and his willingness to face death head-on. As the years passed, Doc Holliday's health continued to decline. The tuberculosis that had plagued him for so long took its toll. In 1887, he moved to Glenwood Springs, Colorado, hoping the hot springs would provide some relief. But on November 8, 1887, at the age of 36, Doc Holliday succumbed to his illness. Doc Holliday was buried in Linwood Cemetery, overlooking the town of Glenwood Springs. His life was short but filled with adventure, danger, and a relentless pursuit of freedom. John Henry Doc Holliday remains a symbol of the untamed West, a man whose intellect and courage left a lasting legacy. His story is one of resilience and survival, a testament to the rugged individualism that defined an era.
In the rugged landscapes of the American Southwest, a figure emerged who would become a symbol of resistance, defiance, and the unyielding spirit of the Apache people. His name was Geronimo, a leader whose name would echo through history as both a fierce warrior and a tragic emblem of the struggle between Native American nations and the imposing forces of government powers. Geronimo was born in 1829 near the Upper Gila River in present-day New Mexico. Named Goyakla, meaning one who yawns, his early years were shaped by the rugged terrain of the Southwest. Geronimo was immersed in the ways of the Apache, learning the skills of hunting, tracking, and warfare. The Apaches were a nomadic people, their lives intertwined with the land they called home. Soon Geronimo's life would be struck by tragedy, and it would set him on a path of vengeance and warfare. In 1851, while Geronimo was away trading, Mexican soldiers attacked his camp, slaughtering his wife, mother, and 3 children. This act of brutality ignited a deep-seated hatred within Geronimo. Swearing vengeance, he became a warrior dedicated to fighting against the Mexican forces that had taken everything from him. For years, Geronimo waged a relentless campaign against the Mexican military. His raids were swift and deadly, targeting settlements and outposts across the border. Geronimo's knowledge of the land and his ferocity in battle made him a formidable opponent. He became a figure of fear, a ghost who struck without warning and disappeared into the desert as quickly as he had come. Because of his fierce fighting, the Mexicans would call out to Saint Jerome or Saint Geronimo for help. This is how Geronimo earned his name. As the years passed, the Apache faced a new threat, an expanding United States that sought to settle the territories of the West. By the 1870s, tensions between the Apaches and the U.S. Army had escalated into open conflict. The U.S. government, determined to subjugate the Apache, launched a series of campaigns to force them onto reservations. Geronimo became the face of the Apache resistance. Refusing to submit, he led his people in a series of escapes from the reservations, evading capture and continuing to wage guerrilla warfare. In 1882, the U.S. government intensified its efforts to subdue the Apache resistance, appointing General George Crook to lead a campaign against Geronimo and his followers, and finally bring an end to the Apache resistance. The campaign took place in the unforgiving terrain of the Arizona and New Mexico deserts, as well as the rugged Sierra Madre Mountains in northern Mexico. Geronimo's band was small, consisting of a few dozen warriors, women, and children. However, their knowledge of the land gave them a significant advantage. They knew the hidden trails, water sources, and natural shelters that allowed them to move swiftly and stay ahead of their pursuers. Crook's troops, which included both regular soldiers and Apache scouts, faced immense challenges. The scorching heat, lack of water, and difficult terrain tested their endurance. Despite these obstacles, Crook stayed determined to finally capture Geronimo and put an end to his resistance. Geronimo's resistance was a mix of desperation and determination. The conditions for the Apache on the San Carlos Reservation were dire, with poor living conditions, lack of resources, and the loss of their traditional way of life. This fueled Geronimo's determination to continue fighting for freedom. In March 1886, Geronimo met with Crook to discuss terms of surrender. For several days, terms were discussed but never agreed on. Geronimo and his band continued their resistance, and Crook's campaign continued. Failing to capture Geronimo, Crook was replaced by General Nelson Miles. While previous military leaders had focused on large-scale battles, Miles shifted the focus to a war of attrition, harassing Geronimo's band until they were exhausted and cut off from supplies. In July 1886, Miles ordered Lieutenant Charles B. Gatewood to find Geronimo and demand surrender. Gatewood was an experienced soldier and understood the Apaches very well. With only 5 other men, Gatewood set out to find Geronimo. After a month of searching, Gatewood and his men found Geronimo in Mexico. Gatewood told Geronimo he needed to surrender or he would face worse consequences. Geronimo's band numbered only 37. There were more women and children than warriors, and they were starving. Geronimo accepted the terms. "Once I moved about like the wind," Geronimo said. "Now I surrender to you, and that is all." On September 4th, 1886, after months of resistance, Geronimo surrendered to General Miles near Skeleton Canyon in Arizona. It was the 3rd time Geronimo had surrendered to U.S. authorities, but this time it was final. Geronimo and 500 other Apache were sent to Fort Marion, Florida. The imprisonment in Florida was devastating. The hot, humid climate of Florida, combined with the lack of familiar food, exacerbated the suffering of the Apache prisoners. Diseases like malaria and tuberculosis were rampant in the swampy region, and the confined living conditions contributed to the spread of illness. Many died from sickness, especially children and elderly members of the group. Despite being a prisoner, Geronimo became an iconic figure in the American imagination. His fame as the last great Apache leader who had resisted U.S. forces for decades made him an object of public fascination. This led to opportunities for Geronimo to participate in public events, often under government supervision, which paradoxically increased his fame, but also exploited his image. Geronimo attended various public fairs, exhibitions, and expositions where people lined up to see the famous Apache leader. He sold autographs and souvenirs, including photos. These appearances brought Geronimo a level of celebrity, but they were bittersweet, as they were a reflection of his status as a prisoner and curiosity, rather than a free man or respected leader. In 1909, Geronimo fell from his horse while riding back to his home at Fort Sill. He lay injured in the cold for several hours before being found. As a result, he developed pneumonia, from which he never recovered. On February 17, 1909, Geronimo died in a military hospital at Fort Sill. His last words were reportedly, "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive."
Che Guevara was a revolutionary, idealist, and militant icon. To some, he embodied the struggle for freedom. To others, he was a ruthless enforcer of authoritarianism. His unyielding pursuit of revolution brought suffering in Cuba, almost provoked nuclear war, and ended with death in a Bolivian jungle. Che was born on June 14, 1928, in Rosario, Argentina, to a middle-class family of Spanish-Irish descent. Despite his upbringing in relative privilege, Guevara's childhood was marked by struggles with chronic asthma, which shaped his personality and fueled his determination. His parents held progressive political views, and their home exposed young Che to discussions about leftist politics. This environment planted the seeds for his later political convictions. Che pursued a medical degree at the University of Buenos Aires, but it was during his travels across Latin America that his ideology began to shift profoundly. In 1952, he embarked on a motorcycle journey through countries like Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. The poverty, inequality, and exploitation he witnessed during this trip had a profound impact on him, reinforcing the idea that systemic change was needed to address social injustice. After returning from his travels, Che became more engaged with left-wing political movements and Marxist ideas. He read extensively, drawing inspiration from Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and other revolutionary theorists. His experiences convinced him that only armed struggle could liberate the working classes from exploitation. By 1954, his ideological transformation was complete when he witnessed the U.S.-backed coup in Guatemala that overthrew democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz. This event solidified Guevara's belief in anti-imperialism and the need for revolutionary socialism, marking his full embrace of Marxism. In the mid-20th century, Cuba was a nation rife with revolution. The government of Fulgencio Batista, a military dictator backed by the United States, presided over a deeply divided society. While Havana thrived as a playground for tourists and businesses, rural Cubans lived in poverty. corruption was rampant, and dissent was brutally repressed. It was against this backdrop that Fidel Castro, a young lawyer from a wealthy family, emerged as a political activist. After leading a failed uprising in 1953, the infamous assault on the Moncada barracks, Castro was imprisoned but later released under political amnesty. Exiled to Mexico, Castro began organizing a guerrilla force to overthrow Batista. It was in Mexico that Castro met Che. The two men quickly bonded over Marxist ideology and shared ambitions. Guevara admired Castro's charisma and vision, while Castro recognized in Guevara a disciplined and fearless fighter. Together, they formed the 26th of July movement, named after Castro's failed Moncada assault. In 1956, Castro, his brother Raúl, Che, and a small band of rebels sailed from Mexico to Cuba. Although their initial landing was disastrous, most of the fighters were killed or captured. The survivors, including Guevara and Castro, regrouped in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, launching a guerrilla war against Batista's forces. Over the next 2 years, Castro's forces gained momentum, with Che becoming one of the movement's key commanders. Known for his tactical brilliance and ruthless discipline, Che led numerous successful operations, including the capture of the city of Santa Clara, a decisive victory that signaled the collapse of Batista's regime. Che's ideology was clear: only violence and strict revolutionary justice could dismantle the old order. This belief would later manifest in the brutal purges he oversaw once the revolution triumphed. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba, and Castro's forces entered Havana. The Cuban Revolution had succeeded, but the real battle to reshape the country had just begun. Che became the head of the prison La Cabana, where he orchestrated numerous executions of individuals labeled as counter-revolutionaries. These executions, carried out without proper legal process, were intended to consolidate the new government's control and eliminate dissent. Estimates of the number of people executed under Che's supervision vary, with some sources citing between 200 to 700 victims, and others suggesting even higher numbers throughout Cuba during that period. Trials were often expedited and lacked transparency, with predetermined outcomes. It was reported that Che met with prosecutors in advance to decide sentences, ensuring swift punishment. Many executions took place at night, and in some cases, they were broadcast or publicized to demonstrate the regime's strength. Che's role as a strict enforcer and his personal belief in the necessity of revolutionary violence earned him the nickname the Butcher of La Cabana among detractors. His actions reflected his conviction that terror was a vital component in building revolutionary order, a stance he applied not only in Cuba but later in his attempts to incite revolutions abroad. This darker side of Che's legacy contrasts sharply with the romanticized image that persists in popular culture. While some see him as a symbol of rebellion and anti-imperialism, others highlight the authoritarian and violent methods he used to achieve his political goals. Che's zeal for revolutionary justice knew no bounds. Even young individuals and former allies were sentenced to death if deemed threats to the revolution. His justification? The revolution must be defended at all costs. His cold pragmatism not only solidified Castro's rule but also sowed fear throughout Cuba. After the Cuban Revolution, Che played a key role in shaping Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union. In the early days, the Soviets were cautious, unsure whether Castro's government would embrace communism. However, Che's ideological alignment with Marxism-Leninism and his anti-imperialist rhetoric reassured Moscow that Cuba was aligned with their goals. By 1960, Che's involvement helped establish agreements between Cuba and the Soviet Union, including trade deals exchanging Cuban sugar for Soviet crude oil and a $100 million loan to support Cuba's economy. Che's travels to the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries in 1960 further cemented ties, as he sought assistance to offset the economic impact of U.S. sanctions. These interactions laid the groundwork for deeper Soviet involvement in Cuba's development, marking the beginning of the island's Sovietization. However, the relationship was not without tension. Che's revolutionary zeal sometimes clashed with Soviet pragmatism. Although Che was instrumental in solidifying Cuba's economic and political relationship with the Soviet Union, the partnership grew tense as their goals diverged over time. Che's revolutionary zeal clashed with the Soviet Union's pragmatic approach, which prioritized geopolitical stability over spreading revolutions. Moscow aimed to maintain influence over Cuba without provoking direct conflict with the United States during the Cold War. In contrast, Che sought to ignite armed struggles across Latin America, Africa, and beyond, believing that revolution was the only way to dismantle imperialism worldwide. Che's frustration with Soviet policies became particularly evident following the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. When Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove nuclear missiles from Cuba in exchange for American concessions, Che felt betrayed. In interviews, he expressed bitterness over the Soviets' retreat, remarking that if he had control of the missiles, he would have launched them, revealing his willingness to escalate the conflict, even at the risk of nuclear war. Moreover, Che criticized the Soviet Union for abandoning revolutionary ideals in favor of state-controlled bureaucracy and diplomatic caution. While Castro adapted to the geopolitical realities of aligning with Moscow to ensure Cuba's survival, Che felt constrained by Soviet demands for moderation. His belief that revolution should be exported to other countries through armed struggle was at odds with the Soviet Union's preference for stability within its sphere of influence. The relationship between Fidel Castro and Che began to deteriorate after the Cuban Revolution as their ideological paths diverged. While initially aligned in their revolutionary ambitions, tensions surfaced due to Guevara's unyielding idealism and Castro's need to balance Cuba's survival within the Cold War political framework. By 1965, Che chose to leave Cuba and pursue revolutionary activities abroad, starting in the Congo and later in Bolivia. His farewell letter to Castro revealed both admiration and regret, hinting at underlying tensions. He expressed pride in their shared achievements but acknowledged that his uncompromising revolutionary spirit no longer fit within the framework of Castro's leadership. After leaving Cuba, Che arrived in Bolivia in 1966. His goal was to ignite a regional uprising that would spread socialism across Latin America, following his belief in continental revolutions. However, the campaign was doomed from the beginning. Che and his small band of 50 fighters established a guerrilla camp in the dense Bolivian mountains. His plan depended on two key elements: support from Bolivia's Communist Party and the mobilization of local peasants. However, both failed. Mario Monge, the leader of the Bolivian Communist Party, refused to collaborate, feeling that Che's operation lacked realism and could provoke brutal reprisals. Che also underestimated the challenges of gaining trust among the rural population, many of whom remained loyal to the Bolivian government or were indifferent to the revolutionary cause. Soon food supplies dwindled, and illnesses spread among the fighters. Bolivian authorities soon became aware of Che's presence, and the small group of fighters found themselves trapped in hostile terrain. The CIA deployed agents to assist the Bolivian military, including Cuban exile Felix Rodriguez, who played a pivotal role in Che's capture. On October 8, 1967, Bolivian special forces ambushed Che and his remaining fighters near La Higuera. He was captured wounded but alive. After his capture, Che was interrogated by Rodriguez. The Bolivian government, with CIA encouragement, feared that a public trial would turn Guevara into a martyr, inspiring further uprisings. On October 9, 1967, Che was executed by Bolivian soldiers. His final words were, "Shoot, you coward, you are only going to kill a man." Che's death only added to his mythic status. While his guerrilla campaign in Bolivia failed, his image as a revolutionary martyr endured. Immortalized in the famous portrait by Alberto Corta and in the minds of leftist movements around the world. Che Guevara's legacy is profoundly complex and polarizing, embodying both the ideals of revolutionary struggle and the brutal realities of authoritarian governance. To some, Che represents a symbol of resistance against imperialism and oppression. His relentless pursuit of social justice and anti-imperialist ideals continues to inspire activists. However, Che's legacy is also marred by the darker aspects of his revolutionary tactics. His involvement in mass executions at La Cabana prison and his endorsement of violence as a tool for political change have drawn sharp criticism. Many see him as an emblem of the authoritarian measures that defined Cuba's early post-revolutionary government, where dissent was silenced and human rights abuses were justified under the banner of revolutionary justice. Furthermore, Che's uncompromising ideology, especially his desire to spread revolution at any cost, led to tensions with both the Soviet Union and Fidel Castro, ultimately isolating him politically. His death in Bolivia at the hands of CIA-assisted forces marks both a tragic end to his revolutionary ambitions and a stark reminder of the limits of radical idealism within a geopolitical landscape dominated by the Cold War. In the end, Che Guevara remains an enigma, part visionary, part enforcer. Whether revered as a hero or condemned as a violent revolutionary, his story serves as a powerful example of how ideals can both inspire and destroy, depending on the methods used to achieve them.
And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
In the fall of 1983, the world came terrifyingly close to nuclear war. Most people had no idea how close the United States and the Soviet Union were to launching their nuclear arsenals at each other since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. One historian later put it, "The world was a breath away from Armageddon." During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a deadly rivalry. President Ronald Reagan, who took office in 1981, had strong words for the Soviet Union.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
He called for a strong military buildup and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, which was meant to create a missile defense system. Soviet leaders, including General Secretary Yuri Andropov, saw this as a threat. They feared the United States might be preparing for a nuclear first strike. In response, the Soviet Union launched Operation Ryan, a top-secret mission to gather intelligence on a possible surprise attack by the United States. Andropov and his advisors were convinced that Reagan's aggressive stance was a sign that war could break out at any moment. In November 1983, NATO, a group of Western countries, including the United States, began a military exercise called Able Archer 83. It was supposed to be a routine drill to practice procedures in the event of a nuclear attack. But that year, the Soviets believed it was not a practice, but instead the real thing. Earlier that year, a Korean Airlines flight had been shot down by the Soviet Union, killing 269 people, including a U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald. This tragic event, which President Reagan called a massacre, pushed relations between the superpowers to a new low.
What can we think of a regime that so broadly trumpets its vision of peace and global disarmament, and yet so callously and quickly commits a terrorist act to sacrifice the lives of innocent human beings?
When Able Archer 83 began, the Soviet Union misinterpreted it as the lead-up to a real nuclear strike. A former Soviet officer recalled, "We were sure that the Americans were going to launch a nuclear attack." Soviet military forces were put on high alert. Soviet bombers were prepared for takeoff. Submarines were positioned to launch their missiles, and nuclear weapons were made ready to fire. The world was on the edge of disaster. As a former NATO commander later said, the tension was palpable. One mistake could have triggered World War III. At the same time, NATO and the United States had no idea that the Soviet Union was so scared. They didn't realize that the Soviets thought a real war might be about to start. Communications between the superpowers were almost non-existent, leading to dangerous misunderstandings. As former CIA Director Robert Gates put it, "We didn't know they were so frightened. If we had, we might have done something differently." In Soviet command centers, military leaders debated what to do. Should they wait for more information, or should they launch their own nuclear weapons to strike first? One officer later recalled, "We were standing at the edge of the abyss. If the Soviets had decided to strike, cities across the United States, Europe, and the Soviet Union would have been destroyed in minutes." Historian Thomas Blanton said, "The world was one miscalculation away from disaster." The world had already seen the horrors of nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The prospect of another nuclear disaster in 1983 was all too real. Most people were completely unaware of how close they came to catastrophe. Life went on as normal, with no one realizing that a few wrong decisions could have ended the world as they knew it. Amid the tension in the Soviet command center was a man named Stanislav Petrov. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, responsible for monitoring missile launches. On the night of September 26, 1983, Petrov was on duty when the Soviet early warning system detected what appeared to be 5 missile launches from the United States. These were supposed to be intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. According to Petrov, the system had never reported more than 4 missiles at one time. He thought it might be a false alarm, possibly a technical glitch. Despite the pressure, he chose not to report it as a confirmed attack. As one account describes, Petrov believed, if this was a real attack, the United States would be trying to fool us. We would be seeing more launches or other signs of a real attack. His judgment was crucial. Petrov's decision not to escalate the situation and report a false alarm helped prevent a retaliatory nuclear strike. If he had reported it as a real attack, the Soviet Union might have launched its nuclear missiles in response, starting a nuclear war. His actions were later recognized as a key moment in preventing nuclear war. Though initially not praised by Soviet officials, after the Cold War, he was celebrated as a hero who saved the world. As Petrov once said, "If we had gone to war, there would have been nothing to save. It was just luck and good judgment that we avoided disaster." His story is a powerful reminder of the impact one person can have in a time of crisis. Fortunately, Soviet intelligence officers began to question their fears. They realized that Able Archer 83 was likely just a drill, not a real attack. Soviet leaders decided not to launch a preemptive strike, and the crisis passed. As one Soviet general later said, "We avoided a disaster by the skin of our teeth." As Able Archer 83 ended without incident, the danger passed. The Soviet Union stepped back from the brink, and nuclear war was averted. But the events of 1983 serve as a chilling reminder of how close the world came to destruction. When President Reagan learned just how close the world had come to war, he was reportedly shocked. He began to seek ways for diplomatic efforts that would eventually end the Cold War.
We desire peace, but peace is a goal, not a policy. Lasting peace is what we hope for at the end of our journey. It doesn't describe the steps we must take nor the paths we should follow to reach that goal. I intend to search for peace along two parallel paths: deterrence and arms reductions. I believe these are the only paths that offer any real hope for an enduring peace. And let me say, I believe that if we follow prudent policies, the risk of nuclear conflict will be reduced. Certainly the United States will never use its forces except in response to attack. Through the years, Soviet leaders have also expressed a sober view of nuclear war. And if we maintain a strong deterrent, they are exceedingly unlikely to launch an attack.
The near-nuclear war of 1983 is one of the most frightening moments in history. It reminds us of how easily peace can be threatened and how important it is to communicate, understand, and make careful decisions.
On August 18, 1877, William Henry McCarty's life changed forever. At just 16 years old, he took the life of a blacksmith named Frank Cahill. Cahill, a large man with a reputation for bullying and picking fights, had often targeted the young, thin, and frail William. On that fateful day, after an exchange of insults, Cahill attacked William, pinning him to the ground and repeatedly slapping him. In the struggle, William managed to free one hand and grab Cahill's pistol. Acting in desperation, he shot Cahill in the gut. Fearing that he would be charged with murder, William fled the scene. From that moment on, his life became even more perilous, and he would eventually become known to the world as Billy the Kid. Years later, Billy drifted into Lincoln County, New Mexico, a place simmering with tension. Two rival factions, the Murphy-Dolan Gang and an independent group led by John Tunstall and Alexander McSween, were locked in a bitter struggle for control of the county's economy. John Tunstall, an English rancher and businessman, hired Billy as a ranch hand. Tunstall quickly became a mentor and father figure to the wayward outlaw. For the first time in years, Billy had a sense of purpose and belonging. But Tunstall's attempts to challenge the Murphy-Dolan monopoly made him a target. On February 18, 1878, Tunstall was ambushed and murdered by Murphy's men. Billy was devastated by the loss of his friend and mentor, and vowed revenge. The murder of Tunstall ignited the Lincoln County War. Billy joined the Regulators, a vigilante group seeking justice for Tunstall's death. Over the next several months, the Regulators waged war against the Murphy-Dolan faction. The Regulators tracked down Tunstall's murderers, who were deputies Buck Morton, Dick Lloyd, and Frank Baker. They captured them and began to take them back to Lincoln to hand them over to the law for justice. However, on the trip back, the Regulators murdered all three of them. But this would not be the end of their revenge. The sheriff of Lincoln, William Brady, sought to put an end to the Regulators' vengeance. He was also on the side of the Murphy-Dolan faction. But the Regulators ambushed Brady and some deputies, killing them all. Angered by these murders, James Dolan hired a professional bounty hunter and former Texas Ranger named Andrew Buckshot Roberts to hunt the Regulators down and kill them. The Regulators and Buckshot Roberts would have a showdown on April 4, 1878 at Blazer's Mill. The shootout began when Billy the Kid and the Regulators stopped at Blazer's Mill to rest and eat. But to their surprise, Buckshot Roberts was also at the mill. When the Regulators spotted Roberts, they confronted him. The group, led by Dick Brewer, demanded that Roberts surrender. Roberts refused. The confrontation quickly escalated into a violent gunfight. Roberts, armed with a Winchester rifle, took cover inside a building and began firing at the Regulators. His sharpshooting skills allowed him to hold off the group for hours, wounding several of the Regulators. Eventually, Dick Brewer, the Regulators' leader, attempted to move into a better position. Roberts fired a single fatal shot, killing Brewer instantly. This marked a significant blow to the Regulators, as Brewer had been one of the group's primary leaders and a close ally of John Tunstall. Despite his injuries, Roberts continued to fight on, even as he sustained multiple gunshot wounds. Finally, severely wounded and unable to continue, Roberts died. Though the Regulators achieved a victory by eliminating a key adversary, the cost was high. The death of Dick Brewer left a leadership vacuum within the group, and the violence at Blazer's Mill only intensified the animosity between the warring factions, propelling the Lincoln County War toward even bloodier confrontations. A week later, the Regulators joined up with Alexander McSween and rode into Lincoln to confront Dolan. But the new sheriff, George Pepin, and his men were awaiting them. McSween and the Regulators barricaded themselves in his home. A shootout occurred, resulting in McSween and many of the Regulators being killed. Pepin's men set fire to the house, forcing Billy and a few others to escape. This would be the end of the Lincoln County War. But the pursuit of Billy the Kid was only beginning. After the events of the Lincoln County War, Billy the Kid was widely seen as an outlaw. However, among the Native American and Mexican populations, he was often viewed as a soldier against injustice, a symbol of resistance in a lawless and corrupt land. By 1879, New Mexico had a new governor, Lew Wallace. Wallace, seeking to restore order to the region, offered Billy an executive pardon in exchange for turning himself in and testifying before a jury. Billy agreed and met with the governor, turning himself over to authorities. However, the district attorney, who owed his allegiance to James Dolan, the winner of the Lincoln County War, had other plans. Despite Wallace's assurances, the attorney charged Billy with murder and had him jailed. Frustrated and betrayed, Billy wrote letters to Governor Wallace, pleading for the promised pardon. But his appeals went unanswered. Realizing that his life was in danger, Billy made a daring escape from jail and fled to Fort Sumner. In Fort Sumner, Billy found refuge among the local Mexican and Native American communities. There, he was welcomed as a friend and protector, a young man whose charm and bravery captivated those around him. But Billy wouldn't stay out of trouble. He began rustling cattle and picking fights with cowboys, further cementing his reputation as an outlaw. One notable incident occurred in 1880 during a meeting Billy was having with friends. A cowboy named Joe Grant interrupted their gathering. At some point, Billy noticed that Grant had taken a pistol from one of his friends. Sensing trouble, Billy decided to confront him. Feigning interest, Billy asked Grant if he could see the pistol, pretending to admire it. Grant handed it over without suspicion. While examining the weapon, Billy discreetly emptied one chamber in the cylinder and rotated it so that the hammer would fall on an empty round. He then returned the gun to Grant. As the meeting ended and Billy prepared to leave, Grant suddenly drew the gun and attempted to fire at him. But the hammer fell on the empty chamber. Seeing his chance, Billy quickly drew his own weapon and shot Grant dead. Although many considered it a fair fight, the incident only added to Billy's notoriety, further darkening his already infamous reputation. Around this time, Lincoln County elected a new sheriff, Pat Garrett, a former buffalo hunter and cowboy. Garrett was also a former acquaintance of Billy the Kid. The two had met in Fort Sumner and had a cordial relationship. Garrett even referred to Billy as a brave man. However, upon being elected sheriff, Garrett vowed to capture Billy the Kid once and for all. After several failed attempts to apprehend him, Garrett deduced that Billy and what remained of the Regulators would likely head to Fort Sumner. Anticipating this, Garrett and his deputies planned an ambush. When Billy and his group rode into town, Garrett and his men opened fire. In the chaos, Billy's close friend Tom O'Folliard was killed, though the rest of the group managed to escape. Determined to end Billy's run, Garrett continued the pursuit. He and his men eventually tracked Billy and his companions to a remote spot outside Stinking Springs. Remaining undetected, Garrett set up another ambush. During the confrontation, Charlie Beaudry, another close friend of Billy's, was shot and killed by Garrett's men. Surrounded and outnumbered, Billy realized there was no way out that wouldn't lead to more bloodshed. Garrett promised that if Billy surrendered, no one else would be harmed. With no other options, Billy reluctantly agreed and turned himself over to Garrett. By January 1881, Billy the Kid was imprisoned in Mesilla, New Mexico, awaiting trial for the murder of Sheriff William Brady. Presiding over the trial was Judge Warren Bristol, a known friend of James Dolan. Unsurprisingly, the verdict was predetermined. Billy was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead. Garrett personally escorted him back to Lincoln, where the execution was to take place. In Lincoln, Billy was confined in the courthouse under heavy guard. He was watched by two deputies, James Bell and Robert Pecos Bob Ollinger, and restrained by leg irons chained to the floor. Of the two, Ollinger tormented Billy, often taunting him with his double-barreled shotgun. On April 28, 1881, Ollinger left the courthouse to have lunch, leaving Bell in charge. Billy seized the opportunity. As part of his daily routine, he asked Bell for permission to use the outhouse. Bell unchained him from the floor and escorted him outside. Upon their return, as they climbed the stairs back to the courthouse, Billy made his move. He struck Bell and managed to wrestle away the deputy's gun. Bell attempted to flee, but Billy fired 2 shots, hoping to stop him. One of the bullets ricocheted off the wall, fatally striking Bell. With one guard down, Billy turned his attention to Ollinger's shotgun, which had been left behind in the courthouse. Hearing the gunshots, Ollinger rushed back to investigate. As he approached the courthouse, he looked up to see Billy at a window, holding his own shotgun. Before Ollinger could react, Billy fired, killing him instantly. With both guards dead, Billy freed himself. He unlocked his leg irons, gathered weapons and ammunition, and secured a horse. As he rode out of Lincoln, no one dared to stop him. Months passed with no sign of Billy the Kid. Sheriff Pat Garrett concluded that Billy had escaped to Mexico, where he could easily vanish. But that wasn't the case. Billy had returned to Fort Sumner, a place he considered home, and soon rumors of his presence began to circulate. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett and 2 deputies rode out to investigate. They had a mutual acquaintance in Fort Sumner named Pete Maxwell, and it was in Maxwell's house that Billy was staying. Garrett decided to confront Maxwell, hoping to confirm Billy's whereabouts. As Garrett waited in the darkened house, Billy unknowingly approached. He noticed 2 men outside, but didn't recognize them as Garrett's deputies. Curious and cautious, Billy stepped into the dimly lit room and asked Maxwell who the men were. Before Maxwell could respond, Billy spotted Garrett's shadowy figure in the corner of the room. Unsure of who it was, Billy asked in Spanish, "¿Quién es? ¿Quién es? Who is it? Who is it?" But no answer came. In that moment, Garrett drew his revolver and fired 2 shots. The first struck Billy in the chest, piercing his heart. The second shot wasn't necessary. Billy the Kid was dead. The sound of gunfire brought the locals rushing to the scene. When they learned that Billy was dead, emotions ran high. Men shook their fists at Garrett in anger, while women wept openly. To the people of Fort Sumner, Billy wasn't an outlaw but a beloved friend. Garrett allowed the locals to take Billy's body and give him a proper wake. The next morning, Billy was buried in the Fort Sumner Cemetery, laid to rest beside his close friends, Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Beaudry. Billy the Kid's death left behind a legacy shrouded in controversy. Was he truly a ruthless outlaw, or a young man driven by a desire for revenge after losing a friend who might have altered the course of his life? The answer remains part of the legend, a story of a boy who became an icon of the Wild West.